Good morning, family. Welcome to We Charge Colonialism TV. This is the African Esquire show. I'm having some technical difficulties. I don't know why. So because I'm having technical difficulties, I'm going to need for you in the chat to let me know that you can hear me before I get into details about today's subject. So while I wait for feedback, again, good morning. Welcome to We Charge Colonialism TV. If you're wondering what WCC TV is about, we are a Pan-Africanist anti-colonial think tank, and we push for decolonization. That's really why we're here. We're pushing for a narrative that's going to be prominent inside of the African experience, that's going to highlight the fact that we're all being colonized. We're pushing that we all recognize that the nexus of our issues are really colonialism. That's what we're all facing throughout the diaspora and throughout the continent of Africa, of course. So with that, I do want to open up just before we get started, take you to, okay, yes, I hear that you can hear me on this side. Thank you very much. So since everyone hears me okay, I'm just going to share my screen very quickly before we get into today's subject. So going to We Charge Colonialism's website, which I hope many of you have been able to visit over this time, you'll find a number of things here. If you see right here, here's our sweepstakes that we're doing. Africans Return to the Soil. If you want to register for a convention, for the Convention and Africa Unity Movement for Decolonization is doing, you can do that here. You can also donate on the site. You can register for our newsletter. So just want everyone to keep track of that. And a big thing I'm going to go to, I wrote an article that was published last week called Colonial Constitutions. I'll probably do a video kind of going through some of the themes that I touched on in this article, but I think it's a really good article to read, not just because I wrote it, but really because it deals with a lot of the issues that we face as African people when we're trying to struggle for freedom within the confines of white supremacy, which is what we're going to talk about today, really, with the Black Lives Matter issue, is that many of us are really trying to win a battle when the rules are set for us by our oppressor. And common sense, I think, has to come in at some point and say that if the oppressor wrote these rules for us to abide by, then in that case scenario, there's no realism in thinking that if we follow and abide by the rules, we're going to get anywhere. We're going to continue begging. We're going to continue being in a subservient position. That's really what we are in today. So speaking of this, let's get right into the subject. We're going to talk about a new development that's come out of the Black Lives Matter movement. I'm sure you all know the Black Lives Matter movement. Let's just take a moment to differentiate the movement from the organization. So the movement, of course, I believe you could say, really gained gas after the murder of Trayvon Martin by George Zimmerman. And I would say at that point, a movement was launched. But however, a hashtag came after. I believe the hashtag Black Lives Matter actually came around Mike Brown's death during the Ferguson uprisings and things. So you have this movement that people have been outwardly talking about police brutality and also just the danger of being especially a Black man in America, but Black person, period, in the United States of America. And then, of course, more gets added to that because there's always going to be another casualty inside of this war. And until the war is won, really, there's always going to be another casualty. The only thing is that we're the ones basically taking all the casualties because we're not organized in a way to prevent that. So there's always going to be another casualty. And because of that, social media comes, and then you have this advent of a movement, so to speak, this idea that we're going to focus almost solely on police brutality whenever we're talking about fighting racism. We don't want to focus on other systems so much as individual acts of police brutality. And out of this comes this hashtag that 3 women created, Black Lives Matter. Now, I've always had some questions about the origins. Like, one, I know we all know it's not hard to create a hashtag, right? And one question I've always had about the Black Lives Matter movement is creating a hashtag does not qualify one to run a grassroots organization. I mean, literally anyone could create a hashtag. We have a lot of people who do it all day long, and they don't take positions or position themselves to be the spokespersons for a movement or to be an organization that's going to drive the agenda of that movement. So that's always something that I thought was interesting. I don't know so much about the origin stories, and so I would love if anyone could fill me in on like more of like what are these origin stories, because I never quite understood how you go from being a just people who create a hashtag online to being center focused in DC, meeting these presidents, having relationships with presidents, and having such influence inside of the white liberal sphere, which we know is a white supremacist sphere, even though it's supposed to be liberal. That's how they basically get by, is by being a white supremacist while not overtly white supremacist. So a new story came out, and I think we're going to get right into that, about Hillary Clinton's allies. And we should understand, if you don't understand, the Democratic establishment is really controlled by certain people. Or when I say controlled by certain people are the ones who will have the powers backing them. And Hillary Clinton's one of those people. She is an establishment Democrat. That means she is the foundation of the Democratic Party. That is why when she was running, you saw everyone throw their support behind her, because she essentially has positioned herself to be the Democratic Party. But Joe Biden comes in and tries to fill a space because she didn't run again. But trust me, Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Joe Biden, all of these people, they're really of the same cloth. They are the backbone of the Democratic Party. And that is why you'll never see a real movement within the Democrats to unseat those people, though they have such influence in that particular sphere. So some news came out that Black Lives Matter has hired Hillary Clinton aide who paid for Still Dozier to sort shady finances. And you might say that's just hiring someone, but we have to give a little bit more background context. And that's what we're going to do throughout this video. One background context that I want to give right now is that when we say that Black Lives Matter has hired a Clinton aide, a lot of news, negative press has come out about Black Lives Matter. I think we're all well aware of that. If you're not, I don't want to assume actually that you are. So let's just go through some of the big chunks about what has happened. So with Black Lives Matter, it's been said that the movement that is spawned an organization. The organization has basically had millions of dollars. I believe the estimate is anywhere from $60 million to $90 million that was given to them in donations, specifically after the murder of George Floyd, because in that situation, people will throw their money at a cause. Some people will do it sincerely, other people because they have a political agenda to control the narrative. We're going to talk about that in the later part of this video. So they threw their money behind Black Lives Matter more than any other Black on the ground organization, because they have basically, again, positioned themselves to be the voice of the movement. Now, all this money is sitting there, right? And yet all these scandals are coming about the leadership, that they're buying huge houses and that they're doing these very elaborate engagements and everything. And so basically a lot of the leaders, I believe all three of the original founders, so to speak, have stepped down. But when they stepped down, there was like a power grab, not even a power grab, more like a question, like, okay, who's actually running Black Lives Matter at this particular point? And I guess it was so messy that even somewhere like Amazon, they have a certain page where they have sponsor organizations. They actually removed Black Lives Matter because there's questions about these finances, like what's happening to them. And a lot of people on the ground have said that if this is an anti-police brutality organization, then why aren't the funds going to people on the ground who need access whenever they're trying to do something like a demonstration to protest police brutality? There's been reports that people have requested of Black Lives Matter to give them funds for actual projects on the ground, and that the organization has said no. So very questionable things. Obviously, if you're a donor to that organization, you're probably like, wow, what did I give my money to? And obviously for people on the ground who see these people who are taking spotlight as if they're actually doing the work, yet they're not doing the work. They're just looking like they're doing work. They're going to engagements and wearing cool vests and everything like that, but they're not actually doing what it takes to get African people out of the state of confusion that we are in. Those people, obviously, when you're on the ground, you have a real problem with that as well. So because of that, there's been a lot of bad press about Black Lives Matter. And who do they go to for help after all of this bad press? After all these questions, there's been talks of like, are the IRS going to audit them? Like, what's going to happen next? Well, they go to Hillary Clinton's campaign manager. And from what I've been listening to, reading, he's basically a big shot in Washington, a very corporate lawyer, the type of person who you would think, if you're really a Black focused organization that's critical of white supremacy, the type of person who you would think would not be in your phone book, you know, but they have him in their phone book. And that's obviously something that did not just happen magically. This is because this organization has positioned itself again to be this big player, even when their actual activities are lacking. So they have this controversial campaign lawyer. I'm reading from the article now. He's commissioned the notorious Still Dozier to sort out the nonprofit's questionable finances. Newly released tax documents for Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation revealed that Mark Elias, 53, came on board this month. Elias is a Washington-based election law firm who filed 2020 tax documents for the Black Lives Matter Foundation, which claimed that the group received no donations or gave out any grants despite racking in more than $65 million that year. In addition, Black Lives Matter changed its filing period from calendar year to fiscal year, meaning that they only have to produce accounts for the first 6 months of 2020 and likely have another year to file their tax returns for the remainder of 2020. Now, the question that I'm having right now is, how would you get an election lawyer to sort out your finances as the automatic go-to? I mean, that right there tells me that the elections of these Democratic leaders and Black Lives Matter organization are very much commingled. Because if you have someone whose job it is to get someone elected as on your roster for who is your go-to, and particularly someone who is to get Hillary Clinton elected, someone who was who met with Black Lives Matter, who had sit downs and used Black Lives Matter, I think, to kind of escape scrutiny for a lot of the things that she would not talk about. So she would use Black Lives Matter to talk about, oh, we could talk about police brutality, we could talk about Black people needing recognition, we could talk about those things, but we certainly will not talk about the corporate capitalists who are responsible for controlling the wealth in this country, but also the wealth in the entire world. That's one thing I want us to open up with our analysis of the situation, because we see it as like, oh, like you have Bernie Sanders, it's the 1% and the top 1% against basically the bottom 90%. Well, that's if you're going to limit it to United States. If you open it up to the world, because understand, Wall Street is not a domestic it's not a domestic cadre. This is these are international players. They would not have the power that they have if it were not for the exploitation of indigenous lands, right? So this is everywhere, and she would not challenge the international exploitation, the domestic exploitation, but she would use Black Lives Matter to make herself look like she was for racial justice. This is something you'll see very much as a theme when it comes to the Democratic Party and the willing participants in their charades. Many of us are so thirsty for recognition from the powers that be that we are willing to take full part in their plan to disregard the many of us who are suffering in order to basically have a blackface mimic being the center of the problem. We need more Black women judges. That's the problem. The problem isn't that those judges are being put in a position where they're residing over trials that disproportionately affect our people. No, it's the judges. We need more Black women judges. That's what we need to focus on. Intentionally being misled. That's what a lot of these identity politics are forward or intentionally misleading the people. So Elias served as general counsel for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. He was very prominent in that campaign strategy inside of that administration. And he was sanctioned for lack of candor in a decision by the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, founded the election law firm Elias Law Group in August after leaving this Perkins Coie law firm. And so let's scroll down a little more. So Black Lives Matter took in more money in 2020 from Thousands Currents, a charity that also manages finances of grassroots nonprofits, according to documents filed by the California Attorney General from Washington and California, where Black Lives Matter is based, had ordered the group to stop raising money until they disclose their donations. Okay, that's something that's important, I think, that understand where these donations are coming from. I'm very sure that $60 to $90 million did not overwhelmingly come from the Black community, especially because there's enough of us inside of the community who understand that this organization is not going to use funds for our betterment. But still, they still get to act like they speak for us. So just this goes back to the issue I described earlier. Black Lives Matter is leaderless. Since co-founder Patrice Colliers resigned last year, a month after the Post revealed that she had gone on to buy real estate, $3 million in property purchases came from the movement. The group listed an address in Oakland, California as its office, and it's filing for the California Attorney General, but the phone number listed on the form is out of service. So I want to go to one more story before we get more into we'll get more into some more stories, and also like really focus in on what are the issues that we have to identify with this Black Lives Matter movement. But this is something else that goes back to this whole identity politics being used against us. So Biden we also find out that Black Lives Matter also in their administration, they have a board member who's also very closely connected, or I would say a part of the Democratic establishment. So again, when you're having all of these people who are part of the Democratic establishment, not just like in the organization, but prominent positions in your organization, are we supposed to believe that you do not have a conflict of interest when you're meeting with these officials, when you're meeting with Hillary Clinton, when you're meeting with Kamala Harris, when you're meeting with the next runner? I believe that Hillary Clinton could possibly be looking to run, if not the next election, the one after that. And so you're having these people inside of your organization. It's supposed to be a Black organization. That's what they tell us. But you're having people in there to where the conflict of interest is just obvious. How can you really fairly organize for the people and yet have your oppressors inside of the highest ranks of the organization? So Biden's choice to help with the SCOTUS pick, because Joe Biden is going to pick a Black woman for the Supreme Court justice. That's going to be his election pitch come next time he runs for election. I'm not sure if he's gonna run again because he is very elderly, but if he does run again, that will be his pitch. And whoever replaces him, if he does not run again, they're also going to use this because they're going to be closely aligned with him. So his choice he's asked for help to pick a Supreme Court nominee, and there's a Black Lives Matter board member who's also promotes critical race theory, defund the police. This woman named Minion Moore, she's 63, and she sits on the board of the Black Lives Matter Global Foundation. Now, the thing that you want to be concerned with, she has been a political consultant for Jesse Jackson, Kamala Harris, Bill Clinton, Hillary Clinton, and Joe Biden. Now, she's saying that she will suspend her political consulting and work with Black Lives Matter while she advises them. But again, you have a trend here. The organization is aligning itself with people who are establishment members of the Democratic Party, establishment parts of the Democratic Party. So common sense says that your ability to show candor whenever you're coming to the people and you're telling them that we're going to hold so-and-so accountable, we're going to actually hold these Democrats, feet to the fire when they're telling us these things, when they're telling us that we want to meet with both parties. You're not being truthful if you're telling the people that, and yet you have all these close relationships with imperialist powers. So what we're going to talk about in this video is we're going to talk about, one, why we have to really have a firm stance about this organization, and the actions that they've shown us have shown us that we cannot even pretend that this is an organization that is a so-called Black organization. But the other thing that we're going to talk about is, why is it that these liberals or these Democrats, why is it that they have so much focus on infiltrating those organizations? So we're going to get into that, but first we do have some African news that I want to discuss. So let's get into that, and then we'll get back to the story. You all must know this. I'm sorry if I have a delay on my end. It looks like my screen is frozen. I'm having some tech difficulties, but it looks like I'm good. So I'm sure you all know this, that the United States is going to be positioning itself inside of Africa to really hone in on these different rebellions and coups. And so it's been reported that the United States begins counterterrorism training in Africa amid upheaval. So here we are, AFRICOM in Africa. The U.S. African military force has had a very active presence inside of the continent, despite the fact that the United States has no wars with people in Africa, technically. Some reason, however, they have the right to go in and supposedly train people. So the United States yearly counterterrorism training program for African forces began on Sunday in Ivory Coast at a time of upheaval in which Islamist fighters control large areas, coups are on the rise, and French forces are winding down. Now that's the key right there. French forces are winding down. The key for this is to understand that African people have done well to out the French influence inside of West Africa. We've done well to do what we can to say that we do not want this imperialist force inside of the African continent. But what we have not done well, in my opinion, is having a full picture understanding that it's not one individual country. These countries work in concert with each other. France is not out there colonizing Africa by itself. France is working with all of the NATO people. They're working with the United States. They're working with all these people who are going to work conjointly. So although France might be withdrawing more from the African continent, not just because of the coups, but honestly because it's from what's being reported at home and abroad, it seems like France doesn't have the capacity to keep up, especially when you have countries like Russia trying to compete for that same for that same ability. So France is basically being put inside of a position where they're having to ask their big brother for help. And that's what's happening right now. We have the United States jumping in to save the day. So it says the training program known as Flintlock will bring together more than 400 soldiers from across West Africa to bolster the skills of forces, some of which are under regular attack by armed groups linked to Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. Those not present, including forces from Guinea and two countries worst hit by Islamist violence, Mali and Burkina Faso. Military juntas have snatched powers in those three countries since 2020, raising concerns about a return to West Africa's post-colonial reputation as a coup belt. And that's just the description that the article has chosen, a coup belt. But focusing more on that post-colonial. So this is after being colonized by the West and having proxy governments set up as the new governing force, and still having these national borders being the recognition as far as what's going to be the countries that these African countries are going to survive in. Skip over that and just focus on the coups, I guess. So, this is something that I think we want to also keep in mind, particularly because of what's happening with Mali. So it says France has led the fight against militants since 2013, but popular opposition to its intervention has grown. Last week, it said it would leave Mali, moving instead to Niger. Diplomats fear the exit of 2,400 French troops from Mali. The epicenter of violence could destabilize the region further. Now, the risk that I think that this could possibly have is that this kind of gives license to other West African countries to say, okay, we're going to have to basically go into Mali, meaning the picture is going to be painted, I believe. This is a guess. We don't know this yet, but just from history and what I believe that imperialists do, is that Mali cannot contain this terrorist threat, that Mali is basically on the brink of destruction, and that Mali is a danger to other neighboring West African countries. And so because of that, there's going to have to be this force that's going to come in and fight the extremists inside of Mali to basically bring stability to all of Africa. So this would give the imperialist military like the United States license to go into Mali, despite the fact that the country supposedly has had a coup and distanced itself from France. So the reason why I want to center on this is because we have to, as African people, study the enemy, have anticipations as far as like what we're going to do whenever these things happen, because I want to emphasize to you that they've been well planning for these types of things to happen. They've dealt with coups before. They've dealt with military upheavals. They've dealt with juntas before. And so what they're going to try to do, if the Malian junta is sincere, and I believe that from what we can see, they're going to try what they can to basically go into that country and destabilize it so that they can reassert the norm and the status quo. This is something that I think is well established throughout history. And so for that, as a people, we have to think forward and also analyze, what is it that we're going to do when it comes to these military forces who are going to come in and use the fact that there's this threat of extremism. That's going to be what's going to allow them to come in, despite the fact we can say no, and understand that. That's how things have been playing out throughout the African continent. African countries can say, we do not want these forces inside of our countries, but these countries that are being backed by the US and other Western militaries, they'll say, well, your region is a threat to us. Therefore, we're coming in whether you like it or not. And that gives them the ability to possibly destabilize that country, even as they're trying to supposedly move towards something that is more representative of the people. So it's definitely something to watch out for and keep our eyes on, because these imperialists do not rest at all when it comes to reasserting dominance over the region. So let's go to the next story. Okay, so speaking of, sorry, that's not it. Speaking of Mali, the Malian parliament has actually come forward and stated that they are going to have this official 5-year transition plan. Now, it's important to emphasize that it was stated already that this is what came out of the military junta. We need 5 years to really plan out this government, and we don't want a 1-year transition. And that's really reasonable, honestly. 5 years is, to me, like a good time if you're really trying to figure out what went wrong and what are the weaknesses in your constitution and why is it that you had so many corrupt presidents who were able to take advantage of the people and the people had no access to the resources while these people got rich. That's a good amount of time to really figure it out, if that's what they're really going to do. Now, they went to parliament. That's something very interesting. Mali's lawmakers voted on Monday a plan allowing for transitional government to rule up to 5 years, in line with the proposal by authorities. On Thursday, the ECOWAS mediator from Mali will lead a mission on a timetable for elections. Mali's parliament voted on Monday for the plan. Now, in line with the proposal, 120 members of Mali's 121-seat interim parliament voted to adopt the bill during a session exclusively dedicated to the examination of the draft law on the revisions of the transition charter. The new charter comes after regional sanctions hit the country in January over delayed elections. This delay contributed to a worsen and already souring relation with France, which eventually decided to withdraw troops from Mali. And I believe also Mali cut off ties with France in many ways too. A move welcomed by Ben Diarra, a member of the National Transition Council. He says, it is a feeling of joy and pride. When the occupying forces leave your country, you can only rejoice and congratulate the patriotic courage of the authorities, especially the patriotic president, liberator Assimi Goïta. When the Burkina forces withdrew, it is the beginning of the end of the war in Mali. For reasons why I just said, let's not be overly optimistic, because these people also have other powers, and they have other plans to basically put countries back into compliance. Now, the funny thing is that this actually comes right after Nana Akufo-Addo has just said that he believes that it should be a 1-year transition. In fact, I'm going to go to another article so that you can see Nana Akufo-Addo, everyone's favorite Black or Pan-African president, has put forth his plan for Mali, which of course is just asinine. This idea that, you know, if you believe in nationalism, right, you believe that a country's people get to decide what they're going to do. Now, I'm not saying I know exactly what's happening in Mali. I don't know if, like, you know, if the parliament really, this is what, you know, really what happened. I don't know all that. But from what it appears, it seems like the people are actually supporting this junta. And Nana Akufo-Addo basically went and said that he believes that a 12-month transition in Mali would be appropriate. When asked about, let's see, in an interview with French 24 at the EU African Union Summit in Brussels, which we're going to cover next, Ghana's president said that the French-led troop withdrawal from Mali required new arrangement in a regional fight against terrorism. Akufo-Addo, who is also the current chairman of the West African Bloc ECOWAS, demanded the departure of foreign mercenaries from the region. Now, this is also interesting. You're demanding the departure of foreign mercenaries from a region that you do not reside over. And those foreign mercenaries, basically, I believe, are alluding to the Russian presence inside of Mali, because they've appealed to Russia in an attempt to basically be able to subvert French military presence. He called for the junta's proposal of 4-year transition. He called their proposal of a 4-year transition clearly unacceptable. And he said a 12-month transition period would be an acceptable framework, while stressing that this was not official ECOWAS position. Of course, this brings up a lot of questions. The question of globalism, because although ECOWAS is a regional West African bloc, they are a larger representation of globalism. You have the African Union, you have the United Nations, you have these presiding bodies that feel as though they are warranted to chime in on the politics of certain countries. They won't go so far with other countries. You won't see them chiming in so much with, like, Rwanda, for example. But they will chime in on certain countries in order to basically determine the internal policies that are supposed to be led by the people. Now, let me say something. I'm not a proponent of nationalism in the context of these colonial borders. I'm not a proponent of nationalism in the context of the colonial constitutions, meaning I believe that we have to have a more holistic approach to these problems and not rely on what we've been given. We have to really dig deep as far as what is functional for African people and have a Pan-African united nationalism, one that's going to be able to propel these types of imperialist impediments on our sovereignty. But at the same time, if we're going to go with the idea that Mali is a sovereign country, that it's a country that has their own people who are supposed to be democratically electing people, and they have the right to rebel if they do not agree with the representation of people who are actually put into the political office, Mali is right doing whatever what they should do. Hypothetically, inside of a democracy, it's literally the idea that you have a right to rebel if you feel like this government's not representing you. So they did rebel. They pushed their leader out of power. The military junta took the final step of actually defeating him. And after that, they threw their support behind the military junta. The military junta has set a 5-year transition, which I think is actually a good sign, because if the junta was concerned with consolidating power quickly, you would not hear them put out things like a 5-year transition. These are the things that are happening that are being supported by the people of Mali. Nana Akufo-Addo is not a person who is a Malayan. If you're going by colonial borders, he's not a Malayan. He is a Ghanaian president, and he has asserted himself as the one who should decide what's good for the interests of Malayan people based on a regional bloc of neo-colonial puppets who think that they can determine the internal politics of African people, despite the fact that their own politics are not matching up or are not showing for good governance. So this is something to point out and to be very critical of when it comes to these African puppets, because they're going to have all of this support from many in the diaspora because they're willing to speak more boldly against the colonial powers. But trust me, they're doing that on a tight leash. Nana Akufo-Addo is on a tight leash, just like all of these other imperialist puppets, and they're going to ultimately push for the interest of the global elite. So we have one more story relating directly to this one also, because Nana Akufo-Addo made these comments at an EU-AU summit. And of course, we have to talk about this because it's so interesting to see African leaders just loving their European colonial oppressors, right? So the EU-AU summit, I believe I spoke about this in a previous video, that because of the threat that China poses to the African or to the European presence in Africa and to the US presence in Africa, there's been a renewed focus that we're going to overpromise Africans things. Now, I think they're also promising things that they can't even deliver on, but they're going to overpromise things to these African leaders. They're going to promise deals. They're going to promise infrastructure. They're going to promise all these great things in order to basically have China no longer be the dominant country that's offering things aside of the African continent, right? So there was this meeting, the EU and African Union sealed a renewed partnership in Brussels on Friday, including a launch of 150 billion European investment strategy and increased aid to produce vaccines against COVID in Africa. The Europeans are also paving the way for a greater reallocation to Africans of international monetary funds, special drawing rights for rich countries without a firm commitment, according to joint declaration adopted at the 6th summit of the two organizations. If you don't recall, the special drawing rights, essentially, whenever so they have special drawing rights in the IMF. Essentially, if there is some type of worldwide catastrophe, the IMF will create money, literally create money out of air, and they will create it and basically distribute it to certain powers. Those powers are overwhelmingly Western powers. So without being specific, they're saying that they're going to try to create greater reallocation to Africa. That's basically nothing significant. Our common vision is to consolidate a renewed partnership for solidarity, security, peace, and sustainable economic development. I'm putting emphasis on this because this is the opposite of what Europe's doing in Africa. This is what was pleaded that the African and European leaders who have been meeting since Thursday to reinvent their relationship and install a new software according to the formula used by the Senegalese President Macky Sall. Macky Sall is definitely an imperialist. We know that, or puppet. Let's see what he says here. Okay, it's hard to hear because of the translator, but yes, so Macky Sall is a imperialist puppet here speaking. Now, the meeting was an opportunity for 27 countries to launch a global investment strategy with at least 150 billion euros over 7 years to help projects wanted and carried by Africans, with a priority given to transport infrastructure, digital networks, and energy. All this while ensuring accountable, transparent, and inclusive governance. If you want to know what this essentially is, this is more of the same old happening when it comes to European relations with Africa. The only difference is that they're trying to specifically market themselves differently because China has been having the upper hand over Europeans in the United States for a while, although from what it's being reported, who knows if this is true because it's being reported from Western entities, but it's being reported that China is gradually starting to draw back from the overly investing in investments in Africa. And because of this, they're trying to reassert dominance. So what I would say here for this section is that during the whole China is colonizing Africa narrative, a lot of Pan-African voices, people on YouTube, people on different platforms were outwardly talking about China and Africa, China and Africa, China and Africa. I want to put emphasis on you all to talk about Europe and Africa, which I know might be boring to you because that's been happening ongoing. But we have to have we have to be pointing at all of these people who are exploiting us, because trust me, they have it set that if China were to fall today, right? If China were to basically disappear, who's going to reassert dominance in all of those areas that you were so upset about? It's going to be Europe and the United States. Not to mention that the United States and Europe never stopped colonizing or being a neocolonial power inside of Africa, neocolonial enslaver really inside of Africa. They've never withdrawn from Africa. So I just encourage everyone, let's keep an equal focus on what's actually happening on the ground. We don't have to excuse China. We don't have to pretend China's not doing things that we would not deem in our best interest. Let's hold everyone accountable. And at the same time, build an Africa what is going to be resistant to imperialist influence and their interests being prioritized over the priorities of the people. It's been so long that our people have been oppressed, impoverished, and at some point we have to become tired of it. We have to just say, you know what, enough is enough. And hopefully we can have that same energy that we have for China when it comes to Europe and China and France. I would say we have energy for China and France. We have to have China energy for not just China and France. We need to have energy for every single foreign interest that is going to suffocate the African continent. That's what we have to have focus on going forward. So that is it for the This Week in Africa session. We're going to go back to the story at hand, the Clinton takeover of Black Lives Matter. So what I want to focus on for the rest of this video is the issue of what is it that they're trying to get out of organizations like Black Lives Matter. As I started off the video discussing, Black Lives Matter came in at a very interesting time. Again, I would love any of you to fill me in on the details if you have them, because from what I can find, basically we have a movement against police brutality. People are on the internet voicing their opinions about this. African people are upset. They're sick of it. Particularly, it's different, I think, in the social media age, because these killings have always been happening. I'm sure you all know this. This is not a new phenomenon, but it's like on social media, particularly, a lot of us are glued into it. So if you're constantly being reminded, constantly, it's going to have a different effect on you. So my understanding is that amongst all of that, African people are upset, and you have this hashtag Black Lives Matter come out, and then this hashtag, a hashtag, not a platform, just a hashtag, warrants these three Black women to lead an entire organization that's going to be told to us is the representative of this new anger, this movement to talk about and discuss police brutality, which of course is asinine. I mean, a hashtag does not qualify you to run an organization, particularly a grassroots organization that's supposed to combat white supremacy inside of the criminal injustice system. So what do they want out of this? If you're like me, you might think that from the get-go, the fact that a hashtag became the voice of a movement, and even that hashtag became what the movement was called, you might not think that that's coincidental if you're like me. I don't think those things are coincidental. I think that there's always people who are examining us. This is why I tell you all, be careful what you're saying on social media. Be careful what you're interacting with on social media, because you're offering your data to these entities, and they're really focused on studying us so that they can undermine any liberation movements. So I think that they've studied us, and I think that they're always keeping their focus on what's happening. And so when this hashtag comes out, whether the hashtag was organic or it came from some type of entity, who knows, the fact that a hashtag gets elevated to where people who we, again, don't know of them from being in a community, all of a sudden they get to be inside of this prominent position. That's something from the get-go that has always been questionable to me, and I've never quite understood. But that's beside the point. The question is, what is it that they're trying to get out of co-opting this movement? What is it that they're trying to get out of Black Lives Matter specifically, the organization specifically? What is it that they're trying to get out of it? So I want to talk about one organization that has put a lot of investment, so it seems, inside of Black Lives Matter. I want to talk about this organization because I think that this is a good example of why these white liberal, not just white liberal, white establishment powers try to co-opt our movements by putting their people first, putting them on the news, letting their people be the voice of a movement, even if it began and is organic from where it came from the people, right? Now, this is an organization called the Democracy Alliance. To give you just a little background information on them, This is an organization that is basically comes, I believe, like early 2000s or like mid 2000s, 2010s maybe. They come and basically see that these conservatives have all of this pull when it comes to money. Whenever there are issues that they want to get funded, they have the ability to have the money. I mean, just think about the gun rights thing. Try to take their guns, and you'll have the NRA, which is very well funded, being thrown at you, right? So this organization sees that, okay, these conservatives have all of this. We need something comparable for the Democratic Party. They call this the Democracy Alliance. Some notables who are the big funders inside of this organization, or one notable that I'm sure all of you heard of, is George Soros. He is probably the biggest funder of this organization. So basically, these people come together with all of their money, and they say, okay, we're going to find organizations and we're going to push our agendas through those organizations that we're going to fund. One of the organizations that they were very, it was really highlighted that whenever Black Lives Matter was first popping up around like 2015, they come in and they say, okay, we're going to fund Black Lives Matter. Now, I could not find any substantive, like, okay, they actually gave all of this money to Black Lives Matter, but I'm very sure that because we know of the George Soros connection to Black Lives Matter, we know of other prominent liberal organizations, I'm very sure that while we can't find the actual news saying that, okay, this is how much Black Lives Matter accepted, I'm very sure that they actually did capitulate to this organization because the organization put it out there that they're trying to find a way to fund Black Lives Matter, right? Now, this lets you know their vision. This is on their website. Racial justice is the key to democracy reform. I'm going to scroll down to around the bottom of this article because there's something very important that I want to emphasize inside of this article. They said, in the last several years, traditional progressive activists have reacted negatively to what they consider the failure of Occupy and Black Lives Matter activists to take a form that they regard as familiar and effective. Among the questions we've heard, who are the leaders? What are the specific demands? Why don't they work through the system and mobilize for elections like the Tea Party does? If a movement doesn't emerge in a form that we easily recognize, the fault might be with us and not the movement. Moreover, the direct action tactics of these groups have achieved at least as much impact as other campaigns we've seen in recent years, electoral or otherwise. Administrative relief from deportation, body cameras on the cops, the shift of the public discourse around economy and policing. These are very real and tangible achievements, and they must be minimized or discounted even as longer-term campaigns and strategies develop. That I have tried to argue that this is the time to rethink our notions of civic participation and engagement in order to address criminal justice system and the way it erodes and denies full citizenship to minorities, and also to acknowledge the direct action as an important tool in the continuum of the democratic process. They say, now I will offer just a bit of advice to progressives who believe, as I do, that we need to rethink some basic premises. He says, first and most important, I think our analysis must be broader and encompassing in new ways I've been suggesting. Second, we all need to listen to the voices emerging around us. At the Democratic Alliance, whose history has been civic engagement, blah, 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 the logic is simple. If civic engagement strategies don't take account of the urgent concerns of people of color, young people, women, and others who have been left out of the political process for many years, and if these groups don't have a place at every key decision-making table, how can those strategies possibly bring about the robust participation essential to progressive victories? You read this right from their website. Let me just finish. Let me see. From the earliest days. Actually, I think we can finish there. So that tells you right there. That's right on their website. This is about progressive victories. And they tell you from the beginning, they understand that white liberal progressives are not particularly happy about movements like Black Lives Matter or these Occupy movements, things like that, right? They're telling you upfront that most of them are not really down for them anti-capitalist talk, right? And Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is not the most anti-capitalist, but they've said it in certain venues. The leaders have said we're Marxists or something like that. So, of course, most Democrats are not for that. They're of the establishment. They really are. I think we have to understand that. So the turnoff, they're saying, is not the fault of the movements, whether it's Occupy or Black Lives Matter. The fault is of the progressives because they have not gone into our spaces and infiltrated our spaces. If they go into our spaces and they are the ones they said, put us at the table, give us a seat at the table. I don't know why that's such a compliment, honestly, but give us a seat at their table. Then that can become a progressive victory. Do you see what's happening here? They intentionally have it in their mind, organizations like this Democratic Alliance, which is very powerful, that they're going to go out and openly seek us, where we are, where's our frustration. And they're going to find a way to come in and bring us to them so that they can use us to solidify their power. That's why sometimes you have people in organizations who have good hearts. Like, you have some people who actually want to do things, but because they're going through the process and they're going through the system to try to accomplish those things, they're instantly made powerless. You can't go through a system that is based on white supremacy and the subversion of people who are not white. You can't go through that system and think you're going to actualize something for our people. Yet we are told that that's better than what it could be. It's better to have a seat at the table rather than basically be off on your own. I would submit to you, we have not benefited at all from any seats at any tables. If you haven't seen, again, go back to when Black Lives Matter met with Hillary Clinton. You had all of them deraying his vest and everyone sitting at the table with Hillary Clinton and talking about how horrible it is being Black. And she gave him her heart. Oh, I hear you, right? What has that done for us? What did it do for the African community of America? What did it do for us when some of our most loved and upheld leaders for the Democrats met with Joe Biden at the beginning of his presidency, or right before he was about to take office, and he told them to their face, I'm not going to do nothing for y'all. I did enough for y'all, and that's what it is. What did that do for us? What is this table supposed to do for our people? So you see right there, right? Black Lives Matter, the reason why we have to do away with it, it's not necessarily that every single aspect of it is bad. You know, sometimes I would say that, actually, I would say most times, things that have to be done away with have some things that you might agree with, particularly like whenever you're trying to build something authentic for the people. You'll have institutions that have policies you agree with. Maybe you agree with things like defund the police. Maybe you agree or you hate critical race theory. Maybe you love the critical race theory. Maybe you agree with some things. But the way that they get you is that they put certain things that they know that most of us might feel okay with. But under those things are policies or agreements or relationships that go completely contrary to liberation. Liberation means freedom. Liberation cannot be achieved when you're still tied at the hip to your oppressor. Like, it can't happen. So this is what they're offering us. And yet many of us, because we see the good, we're not willing to challenge the organization as a whole. But what I would submit to everyone is that we take serious that these types of organizations that are coming in with these subversive agendas, we have to do away with them completely. No organization is going to be an organization that you completely agree with. I understand that. But when you have an organization being infiltrated by the establishment, that which to me is the same thing as the feds, you have to have a hard line. Especially the biggest thing with Black Lives Matter is that they were literally chosen to represent us, not by us. That to me means that we have to be very hardcore when it comes to them in this organization. You deal with individuals from the organization. Okay, fine. Don't for a moment think that them coming in, particularly the people who are higher ups, because there are people who are affiliated with Black Lives Matter who have no clue what's going on, as far as these top people. Don't let them come in and have a position in your community saying we're Black Lives Matter, we're here to help, when they're not actually there for that reason. It's about accountability. That's really what it's going to come down to, I believe. So I want to talk about one more story before I close out. Now, this story, it just basically hits it home, I think, how the Democratic Party hijacked Black Lives Matter. I'm sure we all know by now, yes, it's been hijacked by the Democratic Party, but let's just talk about a little bit of the more specifics. So it starts with a quote by Malcolm X. Malcolm X would have... it was recently Malcolm X's the anniversary of the assassination, and I remember I used to spend a lot of time on social media and just post quotes and things like that. Sometimes I don't really want to do that anymore, because it's very sad when I realize that this person died and gave his life for something that is like, you could have saved your life, because the people who are selling out to the Democrats, the people who are selling out to these establishment folk, are even louder than they were then. So this is something I've felt recently, that is, to me, the biggest honor for Malcolm X is when we can finally root these things out of our community. And I think, depending on where you live, it's also really relevant, because I didn't know that Joe Biden was so loved in the South, but apparently when Black communities in the South, they were the ones that saved his presidency. So it's going to take a lot of work for us to make Malcolm X's death mean something, but let's not pretend that we've done what we need to do, because we're still allowing organizations and we're still allowing white liberals to do the same thing that they've always done to us. And like, he never said it. Like, it's like we never heard Ballard or the Bullet. It's like, oh, it never happened. No, this happened, and we should have learned by now. But unfortunately, we haven't organized properly to combat these types of infiltrators in our communities. So let's go in. It says, this was seen in 1972. President-elect Joe Biden, then Senator Biden, supported desegregation of schools, yet actively pushed to prevent Black students from being bused to predominantly white schools. Biden has also pledged to reach a target of 100% clean energy, a stark contrast to Trump, who pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Agreement, yet his nominee's choice for Secretary of Energy was formerly a consultant for BP. So, of course, we know that the Democrats, they lie about things. They say that they want to push for things, but then they come back and push in a way that's going to still support those who they really want to support. They have industries that they want to support. They want to support the oil industry. So forget what they say about climate or whatever. Their agenda is to ultimately support those friends who are backing them financially, and really are the people who are running this country, I would say. Now, the goal is a space where change seems to occur but does not disturb established institutions, as Noam Chomsky, I don't know if I say his name right, said. And how the world works, the smart way to keep people passive and obedient is to strictly limit the spectrum of acceptable opinions, while all the time the presupposition of the system are being reinforced by the limits put on the range of the debate. Now, here we go. As peaceful protests erupted after the murder of Tamir Rice and Eric Garner, both cases failed to prosecute the police officers involved. From 2014 to 2020, 9 high-profile cases saw mass protests against police killings, of which 6 saw no prosecution for police officers involved. Breonna Taylor's case, 2020, saw no murder charge for any police officers involved. Although peaceful protests are seen as an acceptable form of outrage by the Democratic Party, riots in the face of institutional inaction are not. As Black Lives Matter gained steam, white liberal America split into 2 camps: those who promised to be active allies and those who wanted to shift the movement to counter conservatives. Black Lives Matter protests erupted across the country after George Floyd's murder, 2020. Some of the protesters chose to riot as a means of resistance. Conservative politicians openly dismissed the movements and highlighted the riots as an instrumental reason to reject Black Lives Matter. They're not protesters. Those aren't they are anarchists. They're agitators. They're rioters. They're looters, Trump said. By the way, I always just had a real issue with how, so yes, Trump said this. If you all remember, though, when there was a riot in Baltimore, uprising, whatever you want to call it, in Baltimore, and Barack Obama gets on TV and he says, they're thugs. They're not protesters. They're thugs. This is he actually said this. Could you imagine, like, had that happened under Trump? I mean, oh my gosh. And he said this, and my question is always, when people say these things, you talk about peaceful protesting, but isn't there unpeaceful protesting? So if peaceful protesting are your thugs, or peaceful protesting are your anarchists, but aren't these people non-peacefully protesting? That's something that always irks me when people say riots is not a form of protest. We know that that's not true. In fact, the whole Boston Tea Party. Was that not a protest? All right, so Biden himself supported Black Lives Matter, but openly condemned the riots, of course. Democrats played lip service to supporting Black Lives Matter, with the party officially endorsing the movement of their platform, okay? But refused to challenge the institutions that are necessary for effective change. As progressive Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in response to Democrats losing seats in the election, they're already finger pointing, and this was progressive's fault, and this was the fault of the movement of Black Lives Matter, right? So this is where Black Lives Matter becomes no longer useful to the establishment during the election, whenever, and not just the election nationally, but also a lot of the local elections. You see things swinging the other way, as they do. And basically the swinging away of saying like, oh, we don't want defunding the police, which is their position. We don't want defunding the police. We want more police. We want more, we don't want recourse there. We want more education that's going to be the same. Things swung the other way, and Democrats saw that they were losing seats, but the issue now becomes, okay, let's distance ourselves from this party. Now, as I said, at this point, Black Lives Matter had already been, and the Democratic Party had already endorsed the Black Lives Matter, but they've seen them as no longer useful to them, which is why you're seeing them more and more being disposable to the party establishment. Biden's comments on rioting, let's actually skip this part and get to the bottom. Another aim of Black Lives Matter is working towards defunding the police, which, I don't know how you all feel about that. I feel like it's reformist to me personally, but for many, this means reallocating resources towards community-based services, which assist in mental health, addiction, housing, curbing police budgets, things like that. Biden has openly denounced this goal, instead promising to increase the police budget via community-oriented policing services, which would deliver $300 million in grants to municipalities to hire additional police officers. Interestingly enough, cops was a byproduct of the controversial 1994 bill, which Biden was instrumental in creating. And Kamala Harris, we see Vice President-elect, she has a mixed track record on the criminal justice prosecution. Obviously, she was a prosecutor herself. Her office refused to prosecute more various killings of police officers. We know this. The overall claim that the Democratic Party supports Black Lives Matter movement and progressive policies of people of color do not seem to translate into reality. Increasing police budgets and police presence stands in direct opposition to the outlined goals of Black Lives Matter. The Democratic Party's platform of 2020 also omitted policies for defunding the police, made sure to mention that the criminal justice system has overpoliced and underserved Black and Latino communities. The Pew Research Center found that 86% of overall Black Americans, 77% of Hispanics, 91% of white Democrats support Black Lives Matter. This is indicative of why Democratic Party uses the movement as a talking point to gain support from white liberal voters in an illusion to change, to gain votes from communities of color. Now, the takeaway that I think we should all have from this article like this is that clearly whenever they're putting forth these positions and these stances, they get by simply saying we endorse Black Lives Matter, but we're not going to actually endorse certain things that are controversial to our base, because that is not useful to our overall accomplishing of what we need to accomplish. So then Black Lives Matter, what are you there for? If you're not there to push policy that's actually going to do what you say that you want an end to police brutality, you want a bunch of things. If you check their website, they want a bunch of things, right? Yet you are willing to be the face for the Democratic establishment, even though you're not getting promises back. You're willing to be the one who's going to be the Black friend of Joe Biden and Kamala Harris and all these people. You're willing to basically allow your movement, so-called movement, or your organization to be completely used and manipulated by the Democratic establishment without actually pushing for the goals and the substantive goals of those organizations. Then that tells us right there, you're only there to be a proxy. You're not there for actual movement and shaking of what's happening in our communities. So it's on us as a people to know that organizations, when they come from the Democratic establishment, when they are supported by the white liberal media, when they're supported inside by Amazon.com, when they're supported by the capitalist establishment that we know is our enemy, and when they receive all of the support from politicians who want to use them as a way to say, hey, I have my Black card. But when it comes to actual things that they're willing to push that are in line with that organization, well, it's not my business. then you know why they're here and why they're operating. They're literally here. They're here to thwart liberation. They're there to make sure that our agenda doesn't get too radical. They're there to make sure that their funders are pleased. They're there to make sure that the Democrats have a cover so that they can come and say that we're for Black people. That's what they're here for. And that's not anything that's good for us. So at this point, I would just hope that with these new Clinton infiltrations in Black Lives Matter and this history of funding coming from these people like George Soros, we can kind of wake up to see that organizations will always be used against us, but we don't have to be willing participants inside of this game that's being played with us. We can out these organizations. We can distance ourselves from the organizations. We can pull people out who are getting involved with them because they think that something good is happening. We can be active in doing those types of things because we have to be. If not, then we're basically throwing our people out to the wolves because we know by now that these organizations are not there for us, but they're there for our enemies and our oppressors to gain the upper hand inside of our fight for liberation. So that's all I have on this. Thank you all for joining. I hope you all got something out of this. I will share the article link after I'm able to end the broadcast. I'll put everything in the description. So thank you, everyone. I will see you all in the next video.